A solitary mechanic, his skin dark as the winter night, finds a mother and her 2 children stranded in a fierce blizzard. The older boy, no more than 7, clutches his infant brother close, shielding him from the punishing wind as their mother collapses into the snow. The mechanic risks his own life to save them, unaware that this one act of compassion will be repaid in full, forever altering the course of his life. But before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment and say hi. The wrench slipped from Caleb Thompson's numb fingers, a sharp clang echoing off the old woman's pipes before being swallowed by the wind's low, ceaseless howl. For the better part of an hour he'd been on his back working beneath the cabin to patch a burst pipe. When he finally slid out, his breath billowed in foggy clouds, lost almost instantly in the swirling white haze. Martha Givens stood in the doorway, her slight figure wrapped in a thin blanket. Her eyes, a weary pale blue, watched him with a silent anxiety, as if the cold itself might snatch him away. "It'll hold until sunrise," Caleb assured her, wiping snow from his sleeves. She reached into her apron, her hands trembling from more than just the cold, and offered a folded $20 bill. Caleb shook his head, a small, kind smile touching his chapped lips. "Save it for heating oil." Her protest was lost to the wind. By the time Caleb got into his truck, the snow had thickened into a solid curtain of white. The road was a mere suggestion, obscured by drifts. The wipers grumbled under the weight of ice, a slow, labored beat against the glass. The world beyond his headlights was a swirling vortex, snowflakes ticking relentlessly against the windshield. Nights like this were a stark reminder of a man's insignificance against the power of nature. He tightened his grip on the wheel, leaning forward as if his will alone could pierce the gloom. Caleb had learned early that life rarely offered second chances. His father had been a ghost from a past he couldn't remember, leaving him to navigate the world alone. Yet deep inside him a quiet conviction remained: people deserved help simply because they were people. At 16 he'd pulled a neighbor's boy from an icy lake, carrying him home without a word to anyone. A good deed, his father had always said, didn't need an audience. The storm pressed against the truck with a mournful groan. Just as Caleb was about to secure the last shutter on his own small home, he heard it. Faint at first, a high, fragile sound cutting through the wind's whistle. He paused, tilting his head, the cold biting at his ears. Came again, a cry. Then another, sharper this time, too full of raw desperation to be the wind. Without a second thought he grabbed his thickest coat, pulled on his boots and snatched the flashlight from its hook. The snow was relentless, stinging his eyes, filling his footprints as soon as they were made. He pushed toward the sound. Near the edge of the road, half buried in a drift, he found them. His flashlight beam landed on a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, huddled tight, clutching a bundle to his chest. The blanket was soaked and crusted with ice. The cry came again, a weak whimper from the bundle. Caleb knelt down. "Hey," he said softly, "I'm here." The boy's lips were too chapped and trembling to form words. The bundle stirred, and a faint cry confirmed it was an infant. Beside them, half buried, lay a woman. Her hair was matted to her face, her skin blotchy from the cold. Caleb touched her cheek, which was burning hot beneath a layer of frost. She was breathing, but barely. He moved quickly. "We're going inside now." He lifted the woman with one arm as if she were weightless and gestured for the boy to follow. The child stumbled behind him, one hand clinging to Caleb's coat. Inside Caleb's cabin, the heat radiated from the wood stove. He laid the baby on the couch, carefully peeling away the frozen blanket and swaddling him in a thick quilt. He dipped a cloth in warm water and gently dabbed the baby's hands and feet. The infant whimpered faintly but continued to breathe. The boy stayed close to his mother, his eyes darting to Caleb with suspicion. Caleb simply handed him another dry blanket and gestured toward the fire. He laid the woman on a pallet near the stove, replaced her wet coat with one of his sweaters, and covered her with heavy wool. He poured hot water into 2 mugs, setting one near the boy and holding the other for the woman. For a time, the only sounds were the fire's crackle and the storm's pounding. The boy, still shivering, kept glancing at the baby in Caleb's arms. Caleb sat in his rocking chair holding the tiny bundle close, rocking without conscious thought. The woman, whose color was now returning, stirred and opened her eyes. Her gaze found the baby first, then the boy, then finally Caleb. Confusion flickered across her face before softening. She swallowed hard, her voice a near whisper. You brought us in. Thank you. The raw sincerity in her words was all that was needed. Caleb nodded. You're safe now. Just rest. She closed her eyes for a moment, soaking in the warmth. When she spoke again, her voice was slow and heavy. We were trying to get to my sister's. My husband passed 6 months ago. Her voice hitched. We stayed in a barn last night, but the wind took the roof. I tried to keep going, but... She trailed off, exhaustion pulling her under. Outside, the wind raged on. Caleb knew they weren't going anywhere tonight. The storm didn't relent. It hammered the cabin walls with a deep, constant roar, blurring the windows into a sheet of white. There was no horizon, no hint of where the sky met the earth. Caleb stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal, the scent of cinnamon filling the air. Behind him, the fire snapped and shifted, casting a golden light over the pallet where Grace still rested. Noah sat cross-legged on the rug, his small body wrapped in one of Caleb's old flannel shirts. The boy watched Caleb's every move, wary but curious, like a stray animal weighing whether a hand could be trusted. Caleb set a steaming bowl in front of him. Careful, it's hot. Noah hesitated, glancing at his mother, who gave a faint nod. Only then did he take a small spoonful, his hands trembling less from cold and more from nerves. Caleb poured himself some coffee and sat across from the boy. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he told a story about a winter when he was 10 and the Thompson farm was snowed in. We had to dig a tunnel just to get to the barn, he said, a faint smile on his lips. My father tied a rope from the house to the chicken coop so we wouldn't get lost in the whiteout. You couldn't see 2 feet ahead. Noah's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Did you make it? Caleb nodded. We made it. Lost a few shingles, but the chickens were fine. Tougher than they look. The boy almost smiled at that, the corners of his mouth twitching before he hit it. Grace watched from the firelight, her expression softer than the night before. By the second day, her fever had broken, but a new worry had taken its place. Eli's breathing was rattling and his tiny nose was raw and red. She held him close, her eyes fixed on his face, willing him to be warm. Caleb noticed the way she tightened the blanket around the baby. He's strong, Caleb said quietly, placing another log on the fire. But we'll keep him warmer still. That night, as the cabin settled into shadows and the storm's voice was a low growl, Caleb woke from his bedroll to find Noah awake. The boy was sitting by the fire with Eli in his lap, trying clumsily to wrap a small quilt around his brother. Caleb knelt beside him, bringing a fresh towel he had warmed by the stove. Here, he murmured, wrapping it around Eli's chest and feet with practiced care. This will hold the heat longer. Noah watched him, eyes wide in the flickering light. You did good keeping him close, Caleb said. You probably kept him from getting worse. Noah didn't answer, but he stayed beside Caleb until Eli's breathing became even. When Caleb reached to adjust the blanket one last time, Noah didn't pull back. The days blurred together, marked only by their new routine. Caleb rationed food, turning flour and beans into thick stews, and occasionally slipping Noah an extra piece of bread. In the afternoons, while Grace dozed, Caleb showed Noah how to stack wood to dry faster and how to tend the fire. At first, the boy worked in silence, but soon he began to ask quiet questions about the tools on the wall, the rifle over the mantel, and whether those chickens in Caleb's story really survived the storm. By the 4th morning, the snow was higher than the windowsills. Caleb pushed the door open just enough to see that the road had vanished, replaced by a smooth, unbroken sheet of white. The sky was low and heavy, promising more to come. He closed the door and for a moment, stood looking at the 2 children curled against their mother. Grace stirred, her eyes meeting his. No words were needed. They were snowbound. The world beyond the cabin was shut away, and no one was coming until the storm gave them permission. It started in the deep hours before dawn. Caleb woke to a sound that was not the wind, sharp, uneven breaths from the rug by the hearth. Grace was already awake, cradling Eli, her face pale in the dim light. Something's wrong, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Caleb was beside her in an instant. The baby's cheek was cold, too cold, and his tiny lips had a bluish tint that made Caleb's stomach clench. Eli's breaths were short, desperate gasps, the kind that told a man with no medical training there was no time to lose. Caleb stoked the fire with one hand and reached for his coat with the other. We need to get him to a doctor. Now. Grace shook her head, clutching the baby tighter. The road. She began, but the old landline phone on the wall crackled to life. It was the county rescue unit, explaining through static that every road was blocked and no plow could reach them for at least 5 hours. Grace looked at Caleb, her eyes wide and wet. He doesn't have 5 hours. Caleb didn't argue. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from a chest near the door, wrapping Eli until only his small face was visible. There's a clinic on the far side of the ridge, he said, fastening the blanket tight with a belt. It's a hike, but I can make it faster than any plow. Grace's hand gripped his arm. I'm coming. They stepped into the storm together, the door slamming shut behind them. Snow clawed at their legs, blinding them, forcing each step to be a deliberate effort. Caleb carried Eli under his coat, feeling every shallow breath against his ribs. Grace pushed forward beside him, her hand on his back for balance. An hour in, the snow was past their knees. Grace's breaths were ragged, her strength giving out. Caleb glanced back and saw her stumble, catching herself against a buried fence post. The color had drained from her face. We can't stop, she gasped, but her trembling legs betrayed her. He scanned the white landscape until he saw the dark outline of a small hunting shack. He guided her inside. The air was cold but still, a shield from the wind. Noah stumbled in behind them, his cheeks raw, his eyes fixed on his brother. Caleb knelt before Grace, his voice low and firm. Stay here. Keep him wrapped. Keep this stove going if you can. He pressed his extra gloves into her hands. I'll come back for you. Grace's eyes searched his face, a silent struggle passing between them before she gave a single nod. Noah stood stiffly between them as if ready to block the door. Caleb crouched so they were eye to eye. I'll bring him back safe, he said, steady and certain. After a long moment, Noah stepped aside. Caleb pulled his scarf higher, cradled Eli under his coat and pushed back into the blizzard. The wind felt sharper now, the snow heavier. Each step was a battle, but he kept moving, focused on the ridge ahead. He could still feel the baby's breaths, but they were so shallow. Deep in his chest, a mantra repeated, "You are not too late." The ridge was a wall of white. By the time he crested it, his legs burned and his lungs ached. But down the far slope, through the swirling snow, he saw the faint glow of the clinic's lights. That sight alone gave him a final burst of strength. He half ran, half slid the last stretch, pounding on the clinic door until it opened and warm hands took Eli from his arms. A nurse's voice was brisk, professional. Oxygen, warm blankets, a heat lamp, but Caleb heard the relief beneath it. Only when he saw the first hint of pink return to Eli's lips did Caleb allow himself to fully breathe. The doctor clapped him on the shoulder. You got him here just in time. Caleb simply nodded, not trusting his voice. Hours later, with the storm still raging, he made the return trip with 2 rescue volunteers. They found Grace and Noah huddled by the shack's small stove, their faces lighting up the moment they saw him. Grace didn't ask if Eli was alive. She read it in Caleb's eyes. Noah took a step closer, looking up at him with something new in his gaze. Not just relief, but a solid, unspoken trust. They made the final walk together to the clinic, where Grace held Eli again, now sleeping peacefully. Caleb stood a few feet away, the heat of the room finally seeping into his bones. For the first time in days, the storm outside felt far away. The small waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and wood smoke. Grace sat on a narrow cot, Eli sleeping in her arms, his breathing slow and steady. Noah perched beside her, his boots dangling, his gaze fixed on his brother as if daring him to falter again. Caleb was speaking with a nurse when the door creaked open. A gust of cold swept in with Martha, her heavy coat dusted white. Her eyes found Grace instantly, and she crossed the room with the slow, deliberate steps of someone carefully choosing their words. I heard what happened, Martha said softly, sitting across from Grace. Her hands, still red from the cold, briefly curled around Grace's. You did right bringing him here. You fought the storm and you made it. Grace gave a small, weary smile, murmuring her thanks. Martha's gaze drifted to Eli, then back to Grace, her expression tightening with memory. I lost my boy in a blizzard like this years ago. He was 5. Fever took him in a single night while the roads were closed. Her voice trembled, betraying an old wound. If I'd had the choice, I would have sent him to stay with family in town before the storm hit. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Maybe Maybe you should think about letting your sister take Eli for a little while until this weather breaks. Just so you can keep him safe. Her tone was gentle, heavy with concern, but the words settled like a chill. Grace's fingers tightened instinctively around Eli. I don't know, she said quietly. It's not easy to be apart from your child. Neither woman noticed Noah by the doorway to the hall, his small hand resting on the frame. He had been chasing a stray ball and had returned just in time to hear Martha's last words. His chest tightened and the sound of his boots on the linoleum faded as he stepped back into the shadows. In his mind, the sentence twisted into something sharper, colder. They're going to take Eli away. The image came unbidden. Eli, bundled in blankets, carried out the door, his small cries fading into the wind. Noah's stomach knotted. He remembered too clearly the night his father had been taken away in an ambulance and never returned. He'd promised himself he would never let anyone take his brother. Inside the room, Grace tried to steer the conversation toward warmth. I appreciate your kindness, Martha, truly. But right now I need to keep him close. Martha nodded, reading the resistance. She touched Eli's cheek before rising to leave. I just want you to think on it. Sometimes love means trusting others to help carry the weight. Grace gave a faint nod, her mind already split between the baby and the paperwork the nurse had left. She didn't see Noah slip back into the room, his face carefully blank. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet routines. Caleb returned with blankets and hot broth, settling in a corner chair while Grace tried to rest. The storm had eased to a steady fall of snow, but the cold was deep. The clinic's generator hummed constantly. No one was leaving until the roads were cleared. Noah stayed close to Eli, fetching water, his hand resting on the baby's blanket as if to anchor him there. When Caleb offered to show him the rescue sleds, Noah shook his head. I'll stay here. His tone was guarded. Caleb didn't press him. That night the clinic's hallways were dim. Grace had finally fallen asleep in her chair, her hand resting protectively on Eli's blanket. Caleb was speaking quietly with the nurse at the front desk. In the corner, Noah lay curled under a blanket, his eyes wide open. Every sound from the hall, footsteps, a creaking door, sent his heart pounding, his mind returning to Martha's words. The storm had already taken so much. He wouldn't let it take his brother. After nightfall, the wind no longer howled but pressed heavy and constant against the doors. The generator hummed low, casting a dim amber light. Grace was asleep in her chair, a protective hand on Eli's blanket. Noah lay in his cot, Martha's words echoing, twisting into a threat. He slid out of bed, careful not to wake his mother, and wrapped a wool blanket around his shoulders. Eli stirred when Noah lifted him, a faint, questioning sound. Shoo, Noah whispered, pressing his cheek to Eli's head. I'm keeping you safe. The side door was stiff with ice, but Noah forced it open. The cold slammed into him and for a moment he almost turned back. But he stepped into the snow, his boots sinking deep. The night was thick and colorless, the moon smothered by clouds. Upstairs, Martha was at a window, a cooling mug in her hands. She thought she saw a small shadow moving across the yard, hunched against the wind. Leaning closer, she caught her breath. Noah. The cup clattered into the sink as she yelled down the hall. Caleb. He's outside. He has the baby. Caleb was already pulling on his coat before she finished. He grabbed a lantern and together they plunged into the snow. The wind stung their faces, biting through their clothes. The footprints were faint where snow had already begun to fill them. If it covers the tracks, we'll lose them, Caleb said, quickening his pace. They fought their way past the old store, through a narrow alley toward the edge of town. Snow whipped around them in stinging sheets. More than once Martha lost the trail, but Caleb spotted a disturbed drift and pushed onward. By the time they reached the old storage shed, his breath was ragged, his scarf frozen stiff. The shed's roof sagged under the snow's weight, the wood groaning. Caleb pushed the swollen door open. Inside, Noah sat on the floor, Eli in his lap, the baby's face tucked under a blanket. The air was bitter cold. Caleb stepped inside, lowering the lantern. Hey buddy, he said, his voice low and warm. That's a long walk in this weather. Your brother's cold. We need to get him warm. Noah's jaw tightened. You're just going to take him away. Caleb set the lantern down and crouched until their eyes were level. He shrugged off his coat, draping it over Noah and Eli. The cold hit his arms instantly, but he didn't move. When I was your age, he began, his breath making soft clouds. A storm like this hit our farm. My little sister was sick. I carried her to the neighbor's house because I thought my folks couldn't keep her safe. You know what happened? They were just glad I got her somewhere warm. No one took her away from us. Families stick together, Noah. Boys. I'm not here to take anyone from you. I'm here to make sure you both get through this. The boy's eyes darted to Martha, who stood in the doorway, snow clinging to her scarf. She didn't speak, just nodded, her expression open and gentle. Caleb kept his voice steady. Right now, this roof isn't going to last much longer. You hear that? The wood groaned overhead, a deep, warning crack. We can talk about everything else once we're safe. But if you stay here, we might not get that chance. Noah's fingers tightened on the blanket. He looked down at Eli, then back at Caleb, weighing something deep inside. Finally, he gave a small nod. Caleb stepped forward, scooping Eli into his arms and holding him close, sharing every bit of warmth he had. Good man, Caleb murmured. Stay right behind me. All right. Martha reached for Noah's hand, gripping it firmly as they stepped back into the cold. The wind sliced at their exposed skin, and Caleb kept Eli's head tucked under his chin, feeling the baby's faint breath against his neck. Their boots crunched through the snow, each step a fight. Then a sharp splintering crack split the night. The shed's roof collapsed in a heavy cascade of snow and broken timber right where they had been moments before. By the time they stumbled into the clinic, the heat inside felt almost unreal. Grace rushed toward them, her arms trembling as she took Eli and pulled Noah close with her other arm. My baby. Oh, my babies, she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Noah, no one will take Eli from us. Ever. We're together always. Noah pressed his face into her coat. I thought. Martha crouched beside him, her own eyes shining. You heard me wrong, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I lost my boy in a storm years ago and I spoke without thinking. I would never take your brother away. I only want you both safe. Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze until he gave a small, slow nod. Grace smoothed his hair, keeping both boys close. Caleb stood back, the heat slowly chasing the cold from his bones. Outside, the wind still clawed at the walls, but inside, something had shifted. They were no longer just surviving the storm, they were surviving it together. In the hours that followed, Caleb stayed close, helping where he could. Noah glanced at him now and then, and when their eyes met, there was no suspicion, only a quiet understanding. Thanks, Noah said softly, the first time he had spoken the word to him. Caleb simply nodded, knowing the boy meant far more than the word could hold. By morning, the storm had eased, though the world outside was still buried under white. News traveled fast in a small town, and by midday, neighbors arrived with casseroles, blankets, and offers of help. Grace and her boys were given a small spare room at the clinic until something permanent could be found. Noah clung to his mother at first, but when Caleb came in carrying a bag of firewood, the boy stepped forward. Want me to help? He asked. Caleb handed him a piece, letting the weight settle in his hands. Within days, talk shifted from survival to rebuilding. Someone mentioned an old cottage by the river, weathered and drafty but still standing. The townspeople made a plan. Caleb found himself sketching repairs, hauling lumber, and teaching Noah how to hammer a nail without bending it. One afternoon, Grace stood in the doorway, Eli asleep on her shoulder, listening to Noah's bright laughter. She caught Caleb looking at her, his cap pulled low, and gave him a small nod of gratitude. 2 weeks later, the little house smelled of fresh-cut wood and new paint. Curtains Grace had sewn from donated fabric swayed in the winter light. The community crowded into the kitchen for soup and bread, their voices and laughter filling the room. Noah tugged Caleb's sleeve. You'll come for dinner tomorrow, right? Caleb smiled. Wouldn't miss it. As the night wound down, Martha found Caleb standing a little apart, watching Grace and the boys. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You didn't just fix a house, she said. You fixed some hearts. Later, back in his own cabin, Caleb hung his gloves on the peg by the door, placing a small knit glove, Noah's, at the center. The snow began to fall again outside, soft and steady. Inside, the sound of his hammer echoed as he worked on a small wooden chair for Eli. A rhythm of warmth taking root against the cold. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.